It's a great pleasure that I introduce you very briefly, Dr. Jim Storr. As you can see from the bio that should be sharing, I believe still, yeah. You can still see the landing slide, am I right, Jim?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not going to read the bio to you. Jim has been a career infantry officer in the British Army, and more appropriately tonight for us, he's been a scholar on military thought. And dare I say, as I'm a war costume right now, reading Liddell Hart and JFC Fuller, I think Jim is in due time is going to rank amongst those legends himself. So really, grateful to have you, Jim. You can see from the top right, there's some books that the book covers. He's written 5 books in total, another book on King Arthur, and another book, Human Faces of War, that aren't shown there. Tonight, we'll talk a lot about Something Rotten. And finally, at the bottom right there, 3 articles that kind of how this all got started for us in Fight Club. Ed Farron, who's co-hosting tonight from the British Army, co-leader of Fight Club. He had sent these 3 articles to me roughly about 2 years ago. I had read them, and every article and every word and sentence in there was like just made total sense. And long story short, these 3 articles were the impetus for some planning and wargaming experimentation that we led at the NATO Allied Rapid Reaction Corps in the UK with great effect. And so it was a real great pleasure to get you on here, Jim. And I don't want to take any more time because we really want to hear more from you and get the audience involved and have a discussion, because we've been waiting all week for this one, or 2 weeks or longer, to have this discussion. So really excited about this. And so as we begin, I turn it over to you, Jim. If you can just let us know what motivated you to write the book, what was the inspiration, and really appreciate it. So thank you. Over to you. And I'll stop sharing and so you can share your slides.
Arnold, thank you. We should get that up in a moment. Well, hello again, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to start by asking you some basic questions. And Arnold tells me that we've got some kind of voting mechanism here. I'd ask you to just simply put your votes in, or your thumbs up, or whatever, to 3 simple questions. Do you agree that, firstly, sorry, we'll go back one. Firstly, that land force headquarters are generally too big. I mean, generally, it doesn't have to be 100%, but do you think by and large our headquarters are bigger than they should be, or about right, or too small? And I don't know how we're going to do that.
Yeah, just as you answer, just pop it in the chat, thumbs up on your screen, whatever. Me and Ed will kind of take a survey here of what everyone's a lot violent agreement, Jim.
Thanks, Arnold. Okay, next question then. The orders that they produce are too long. And again, not always, not in every case, but by and large, we write bigger orders than we should do. Can we have thumbs up or thumbs down on that one?
Yep. Again, but yeah, definitely. Everyone's in agreement on that one too.
Okay, and let's go to number 3 then. Those headquarters take far too long to produce them. Again, necessarily in every case, but by and large, the trend, what we do. Do our headquarters take too long to produce the orders which they produce?
Yes. Again, I think we're preaching to the choir. Many of the people here in this group, in this community, agree that on all 3 of those. Am I seeing the right, Ed? I've been scanning, but
I can see the numbers coming up as we talk. Well, you're in very good company. I started asking officers those things, senior officers, sort of colonels and above, 2009. By 2019, dozens of them had all said yes unanimously. So I then started writing the book Something Rotten. And in doing that, I then spoke to a lot more senior officers, I think another 31. And again, they all agreed. So going on from there to really the question that Arnold said, what approach or my motivation is, first of all, there is a problem. If our headquarters are too big, if they write orders that are too long, and if they take too long to do so, then we have a problem. So what do we do about it? How do we approach that? Well, first of all, let's find out what works. Let's find a real practical solution to the problem. And then secondly, let's work how to do that. And I retired 16 years ago, so I won't be doing that, but help other people like you, to do it. Now, in terms of theory, in terms of intellectual approach, A is empirical as opposed to rational. By rational, I don't mean the opposite of irrational. I mean, it's empirical as opposed to an appeal to logic or reason. In other words, what works in the real world. Secondly, B, work out how to do that, pragmatic. This is not a theoretical question. This is a real world problem. How do we deal with that? This isn't like, say, physics or medicine where you've got some theory to go to. In fact, part of the problem is there's very little or no explicit theory to guide us in this area. So it was looking at those kind of issues through that kind of empirical and pragmatic approach, which is the way I was brought up as an engineer, which took me into writing the book. And already since writing the book, I've moved on to talking to other headquarters, involved in studies, and hopefully soon writing their issues and advising further headquarters and their commanders and staffs in this area. So the nub of the problem, as I see it, is all about planning. Far too much process in decision making. Put that into context. 73 years ago, that was the relevant British handbook. Now, the sort of people who wrote that had served through world wars. Field Marshal Montgomery, for example, who I think at the time was the chief of the Imperial General Staff, been the chief of staff of the division in the First World War, and then had gone on to be an army group commander in the Second World War. That book is pretty small. It's about, well, you can see the dimensions there, but I've got a copy I can show you on the screen in a moment, but it's tiny. Basically, it's a small handbook. And of that, the stuff that tells us how to do tactical and operational planning is about 2.5 pages. And all the British and all the Commonwealth armies around the world that fought in the First and the Second World War did things that are encapsulated on those 2.5 pages. And just to give you some idea, by way of comparison, the British Army currently uses a thing called the Planning and Execution Handbook. I checked it about an hour ago, and it describes the planning process on 127 pages of A4. We need to get away from that. Human beings are actually, sorry, my screen's frozen. I'm just gonna, there you go. Human beings are actually quite good decision makers. We can train ourselves to make better decisions, but in round terms, human beings have evolved over about 2 million years to be able to make decisions, good decisions, about complex and dynamic situations, and do it pretty well. Now, when you tie your shoelaces, you don't need to be taught each time how to go through the process. You just tie your shoelaces. And that's the way into this problem. In round terms, you can tie your shoelaces because you were shown how to do it once or twice, you're familiar with the problem, and then you've done it time and time and time and time again. And that's the way that we need to get into tactical and operational planning. We can train officers, staff officers and commanders to make good tactical and operational plans and decisions without having to go through all of that process. As I say, as it says there, the human brain can deal with all that stuff very, very well, but especially when the situation is familiar. And again, that's part of a way into looking at this problem. What we need to do is move towards training methods which support our ability to develop familiarity and emphasize the quantity of experience. Now, I don't mean trying to make the same decision time after time after time, but I do mean making similar kinds of decisions time after time. So, for example, someone planning a brigade attack might plan a brigade attack in 6, 7, 15, 20 different circumstances, or a battalion in the defense, a defensive position, 5, 6, 10, 20 different circumstances. But it's the quantity of experience which tells them that they should know what to do in a similar circumstance. That is the nub of what makes human beings good naturalistic decision makers. And that's the way to cut away a huge amount of that process that I just talked about. Arnold also asked me to say, what kind of feedback have we had thus far about Something Rotten? Well, the first thing to say is it's selling quite well, so that's pretty good. But I gave a copy to a former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. I was at Staff College with him. I know him quite well. I met him at a formal dinner about 3 months ago, and I gave him a copy. He didn't know I'd written it, or rather, he didn't know that I had written it. He emailed me back about a month later saying he had read it cover to cover, and he agrees with about 95% of it. Well, I put it to you, if it's good enough for DSACure, it's good enough for most of the rest of us. If you go to Amazon, you go to Something Rotten by Jim Storr, you'll see a review by a chap called JWH. I happen to know who he is. I'm not going to say who it is, but I had a pint with him recently. What I would say about the review, oh, yes, it's favorable, but more to the point, I think it's very honest, and I think it's very even-handed, and I wouldn't disagree with a word of it. But more to the point, I would urge you to just go and have a look at it, check it out. And then thirdly, I got an email more or less cold from someone I used to work with when he was a brigadier and I was a major, a long time ago. He went on to be the British Deputy Adjutant General, Major General. And what he said was quite interesting. One of the points in the book was I said that some of generals across all armies, I think, get there by looking the part rather than being the part. And he said that that was the triumph of social skills over thinking skills. Now, the officer who gave me those comments had sat on promotion boards for officers from the rank of lieutenant colonel up to lieutenant general for about 10 years. So I think we can take that as an interesting indication, not necessarily about planning within a headquarters, but about the sorts of people who get up through the ranks. Not all of them. Some of them are very, very capable, high-grade individuals. But in some cases, that's not necessarily their ability to conduct logical assessment as their presentational skills. Anyway, enough of that. Arnold, back over to you.
Jim, thank you very much, sir. Definitely, as to expected, what you were going to say based off reading the book. Again, most of us have been following your work for quite some time. So I guess the big question I'll start off with is, change is hard in a land headquarters. I mean, even more specifically in a multinational headquarters like NATO. But if you're the king for the day, if you're the chief of general staff, head of the British Army, is there, you recommend a lot of things in the book. Is there one thing that you think that'd be catalytic, a change that you would make if you had to pick one change? Is there something, what would you do? Shorten the staffs? What are your thoughts on like one big change?
I think the one big thing is to insist that headquarters do things faster. To put some numbers behind that, give a new mission to a battalion, battle group, whatever you want to call it, in a familiar situation, and insist that 1 hour later they give their orders. A brigade 2 hours, a division 3 hours, a corps 4 hours. Now, I haven't picked those numbers out of thin air. There's good reasons for using those numbers. But what that means is that a battalion, a battle group should be able to go from receipt of orders to execution within 4 hours. A brigade 8, a division 12, a corps 16 or so. Now, if you forced people on command post exercises to meet those timelines, they would very, very soon learn to cut the process. Because they would have to, because they just don't have the time to do the process the long-handed way. They would also very, very rapidly realize that they have to cut the product down to the absolute basics. And thirdly, in the longer run, I think they'd realize that they don't need all those people. You can cut the staff. And if you cut the staff, it helps you cut the process, it helps you cut the product, and the whole thing goes faster.
Brilliant. So just to give you an idea, I just asked in the chat, where's everyone dialing in from? Jim, you got people from, just to show the reach, we've got people from the Netherlands, of course, the UK, Ohio, in the US, Nashville, Denmark, Cardiff, Virginia, Canada, Norway, Turkey. and elsewhere. So really appreciate everyone from all over jumping in. And so the format for the rest of the night, and Ed and I probably talked to Jim for the whole hour, but we're not going to do that, because this is for everybody to make use of this opportunity to chat with him. And so think of your questions. We want to drive a discussion, pick his brain. And so Ed and I will just kick things, we're going to kick off with a couple of questions to get things going, but we want to make this, start putting your questions in there. And if you have the ability to turn on your mic, we'll just call you out, turn your mic on. Again, I can see we got some pretty big thinkers in the group here. I see Brandon McBreen from the Marine Corps and some others. So definitely want to have a chat with all these smart people in the room. So Ed, I'll let you ask that question and then we'll get the rest of the team in.
Yeah, thanks, Anil. And then good evening, Jim. So this is for more of the British audience who are familiar with the British planning process contained within the gargantuan tome that is the Planning and Execution Handbook. So in your book, you were quite scathing of the combat estimate, and you're rather fortunate that you've actually seen a previous process, whereas myself and my generation, it's all we've ever known. And in some respects, I think we're a bit scared of anything that might have come before it. So my question is, what are the key issues you have with the 7 questions process? Could it be revised, or would you replace it wholesale? And if the latter, what with?
Ed, thanks for that. The key issue with the 7 questions, the combat estimate, quite simple. It's utterly unnecessary. Here we are. I showed a slide about staff officers in the field. That shows you how tiny it is. 3 pages of that tells you how to do an estimate. You just don't need all that stuff. I feel genuinely, and please don't think this is patronizing, sorry for officers of your generation, because you've been sat through classrooms for hours and days doing stuff that you don't really need to do. What I think you do need to do is do more estimates and get into the habit of doing them faster and faster and faster. And whilst we're on this subject, about 8 years ago, in the Journal of Military Operations, which I used to edit, there was a thing called the 3-step estimate. It sounds actually like it's a variation on something like the 7 questions. It's not. It's very, very simple. You won't be familiar with it because it was published online 8 years ago, but I'd be more than happy to send it out to people, perhaps send it to you and you can publish it on your website. But in simple round terms, the emphasis should be on the doing rather than the process. Does that answer your question, Ed?
Yeah, Jim, thanks very much. I'm going to get the 3-step estimate link up whilst Arnell fires the next question.
Sure. So Jim, my last question, and there's already a lot of them pouring into the chat here, so we'll get everyone else involved. There's a big debate, or not a big one, but there's a debate about the operational level war. Some people arguing that it doesn't exist. And clearly, as you laid out in chapter 1 of your book, that, and just for everyone else that hasn't read the book, I really like the simplicity and clarity that you lay out the levels and how you lay out operational art. So can you put this to bed? Is there operational level war?
That's almost a metaphysical question, Ed, and soldiers shouldn't have to be metaphysical. None of this exists. Warfare is something that you can observe. You see a war on the TV, right, and they're waging war, that's warfare. Strategy and tactics are things that human beings have invented. They're human artifacts, and we've invented them to meet a purpose. We've invented them to describe things that we find useful. The conduct of war at the national level, we call that strategy. Fighting battles and engagements, we call that tactics, and those definitions we find useful. I personally believe, and I've laid out in my book, that I think it's useful to have a thing called an operational level. It's useful to define it the way that I did. And I go back to my points earlier about being empirical and pragmatic. I think it's useful to have a thing called the operational level, and it's useful to have a very simple, clear definition. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. It is helpful. And so here the questions are pouring in, and Ed, you'll help me go through here. One of them right off the bat was Brendan McBreen, who's another.
Oh, no, so I've got one more.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Ed. Go ahead.
Yeah, no worries. So So I obviously knew where this was going. So Jim, you state, as has been quite clear, that experience and familiarity enables the naturalistic decision making, which you also argue is better than a rigid process-bound method that we're stuck in now. Given the British Army's lack of recent conventional combined arms combat experience or extensive training, how can we move beyond a rigid decision-making process?
Yeah, thanks for that one, Ed. Unfortunately, you had to suffer a whole year at the military academy at Sandhurst. I have no idea what you did in a whole year at Sandhurst. But by the time you get through to being a major, you've done what in British terms is the lieutenant to captain's course, the JOTAC. You've done the captain's warfare course, whatever they call it now. You've done the initial command and staff course, LAND, and you've done your special to arms schools. You've spent a huge amount of time learning how to do the estimate. And you spent relatively little time actually doing estimates because each one is so time consuming and laborious. If we cut the process right down, let's focus not on the process, but on the output, the orders, and on the outcome. In other words, is that a good plan? Would it work? Then spend the same amount of time doing more estimates, many more estimates, but do them quickly. Then you would genuinely just know what to do. You would also know that when you come across something that you're not familiar with, what the basic tools for going back to, if you like, first principles are and how to do that. But that is exactly what they showed us in staff duties in the field. It told you what the basic principles are. And it didn't take 127 pages. It took 2.5. So my real point is I think that armies, or at least the British Army, misspend their officers' time by teaching explicit process rather than getting them to do estimates, appreciations, whatever you want to tell them. Just one other small thing, if I may. I was in an exercise at the beginning of last year where the chief of staff of a British frontline brigade admitted that he didn't know enough about the capabilities of the forces under his command. And I thought that was very brave. So the directing staff then had a show of hands, and there were 2 brigade staffs in the room at the time. And well over half of them said that they didn't feel that they knew enough about the capabilities of the forces under their command. So despite all that training, there was an obvious lack. Now that tells me that our schools, who are full of able and well-intentioned people, they're not doing this because they're bad people, aren't doing the right things. Does that answer your question, Ed?
Yeah, Jim, it does. I'll probably come back after a few others on some
Sure.
ideas that you mentioned in your book, but thank you.
Thank you.
Real insightful. So I see some comments. There's a lot of questions, comments coming out. I've been trying to synthesize and filter them. So Jay Lopez mentioned recognized prime decision making, which I know, Jim, you've referenced Gary Klein's book, Sources of Power, and some of his work. And then Brendan McBreen, who's on right now, he's worked with Gary Klein in the Marine Corps on the subject of decision making and tactical decision games. He asked the initial question of, I don't know if it's joking, but he said, what do you do with all the mediocre officers if you cut the staff down? If we shrink the staffs, as you mentioned early on, what do you do with all these officers that are bloat? And then there's some other questions about what led us to this bloat, what got us here historically. So there's kind of 2, trying to stitch them together for you to kind of address.
Arnold, thanks for that. Now, I'm not going to try and quote the numbers there in the book, but in simple round terms, we've got far more staff officers than we ever used to. I think I'm right in saying it's something like the ratio of lieutenant colonels to majors in the British Army has doubled in 30 years. It's those kind of numbers. But not just that, but the staffs themselves are much bigger. I think we can do with far fewer senior officers. We can do with far fewer intermediate level officers, by which I mean probably major and lieutenant colonel. We can give more and greater responsibility to our staff captains. We can train those staff captains better. But if you started doing that, and one of the things I do in my book is I start looking at just wet finger in the air kind of stuff about the amount saving in terms of salaries. But it's not primarily about the salaries that we save, which run to millions and millions of pounds, dollars, euros, or whatever. It's the fact that our headquarters would be better off without them, and that our armies would be better off without them. So thank you, Brendan.
Okay, and so go to the next question. And if please feel free if you can raise your hand and you can just ask your question and turn on your camera, and you can that way Jim can see who he's talking to. You're welcome to do that. So there's a question from David Burden. What is your view of the synchronization matrix as currently practiced by the British Army?
Complete and utter waste of time. I'll go on in a minute, but just let me scribble something down. Okay, and sorry, but I have to point fault at the American Army here. I forget again all the details, but there was an observation in the early 80s that the American Army was not good at coordinating effects at places like the National Training Center. And so early on in rewrites of 105, there was a desire for increased synchronization. I think the word is not a good one. What it really was pointing towards was increased coordination between the various elements of the combat team, the all arms team, whatever you want. And I think that's a good thing. I think that we need to make sure that in the all arms battle that the various elements of the force are well coordinated with each other. The problem comes that by the end of the 1980s, and certainly as you went into the 1990s, we had got into a process of enforced synchronization from on top. Now, one problem is actually it never works, but secondly, that the staff effort required and therefore the time required to produce those matrices becomes a part of the problem. So in simple round terms, is it a good idea when you've got a couple of guys around a whiteboard coming up with ideas to come up with a timeline and put some markers on it? Yes. Because that helps the planners to, in their own mind, come up with the kind of coordination that's required. Is it a good idea to come up with a thing called, which the questioner called a sync matrix? No, I think it's a complete and utter waste of time.
I think a lot of staff officers that spend a lot of time on Excel, countless hours synchronizing stuff, or appreciate that comment. So I'll go to one more question. I see some cameras coming on, so that's really appreciative. Thank you. Good to see you, Brandon. Let's we got Paul Hollinstead, good friend. To what extent do you see the application of software? Oh, Paul, there you are. You want to ask it? Go ahead, brother.
I'll give you a bit more context. Thanks, Arnell. Nice to see you again. Nice to meet you, Jim. I read the review by JWC. I haven't had a chance to read your book yet, but I was recommended to attend this. Looks like you've mentioned that planners are betrayed by the heuristics, that they're following a very industrial way of processing war, hugely laborious processes, and that you've nailed it on the head, that speed is what we need. Good, accurate decisions passed through to execution of those decisions is going to coerce our enemies, going to paralyze our enemies, going to ultimately deter them. My question, therefore, is like, to what extent, how do you think, well, to what extent do you believe that software is going to support or deliver this rapid application of the mathematics, the insight, the information about what's moving around in time and space? And if you do think that's going to be applicable, where's it going to come from?
Paul, thank you. Spent 2 years as a major straight after commanding a company, working on policy for the introduction of computers on the battlefield. I remember an article written by a Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Boyd, which said that when we introduce computers, we should be able to do things faster, and we should be able to do things with fewer people. And I can give you the reference to that if you want, but it's not important. The trouble is that the way that the computers have been introduced have become part of the problem. What tends to happen is that the computer software leads the staff through a set of explicit processes. That means that they can't easily or readily escape the process and that in some cases they don't know how to. We could instead have introduced computers in a way which helped. As one of my colleagues put it, it was something like bind talents together as a team. We could have done that, and we could have written software which was probably invisible to the user, which just allows that to happen. And to an extent, things like whiteboards, electronic whiteboards, and those kind of things are the sort of thing I have in mind. But in round terms, we could do it much better. We could do it much faster. But the way we have done it over about, well, put it this way, I was working on that in, I think it was 1997 through to 1999. So the 23, 24 years since then has actually sent things backwards, not forwards. Does that answer your question, Paul?
Yeah, it's a really wonderful articulation of how it's gone backwards. I often think that's largely down to the source of where some of this software is coming from and how it's being applied. Back in 1997, there was no such thing as a Tesla or a Google or an Amazon. Yep. And yet I'm going to buy your book on this device without having to go down to Waterstones anymore. That's just saved me time, effort, workflow, and giving me more choice, right? So where do we find that for the military? I don't believe it will automate the wrong processes. I think it needs to be built by the warfighter and by very, very good software engineers. But that's my piece. Thank you.
Right, Paul, thanks. We won't go down that one because we need to allow other people in. But in simple round terms, obviously computers can, and as you point out with a smartphone, can allow us to do all sorts of things better and faster. But that's not what we've seen. Sorry, Arnold, back to you.
No, I agree. I mean, like you put out in the book, I think sometimes the technologies like copy paste has allowed some of these orders just to be, lazy officers, lazy staff officers pasting stuff in, and then the growth of these orders, and they're not concise. But hey, Ed, do you have any? I'm scanning questions here. Feel free to raise your hands. I see a lot of comments that are really helpful. I'm just trying to find your questions that you guys are asking here. Do you have one in that
Jim, I'll jump in. So it's been an observation of mine that sometimes there is a fine balance between doing the thinking for your subordinates and micromanaging and wasting their time, and often what happens in barracks where higher headquarters don't do any planning and just sort of hand you down their problem and expect you to sort it out, and that can go all the way down to the coalface. So noting your aggressive timelines proposed for sort of an hour for a battle group and so on who work to call, is there a danger that HQs sort of fail to do sufficient planning and just pass their problems down?
Well, yes and no. I suspect that can easily happen in barracks. And I was a staff captain both in the Falklands in 1990 and in headquarters 1st Infantry Brigade for the 2 years after that. You sometimes see bad headquarters, poorly disciplined headquarters, passing stuff down in peacetime. However, if you go back to those demanding timelines all the way up the chain of command, then, for example, what sends down to division comes down to a one-page and schematic and a couple of annexes. And so division is really hard pressed to, in the 2 or 3 hours that you allow it, to pass down anything much more than a page or two and a schematic and a couple of annexes, and so on and so forth. And actually, I think in those circumstances, so long as you impose the discipline all the way down and also visit the consequences, because, for example, let's say that division does a bad job and throws a whole load of stuff down to its brigades, but they're on a hard timeline. And at the end of the division's 12 hours, things should cross the line of departure. And this could be on a computer simulation, or it could be at, I don't know, Salisbury Plain or National Training Centre or whatever. And there's a great cluster. Well, actually, you'll get those brigade commanders telling the divisional chief of staff fairly clearly that actually division didn't do its job. So I think after a while, there'll be a bit of a learning curve there. But not necessarily so much in barracks, but yes, certainly on exercises, and I suspect also on operations. Thank you.
So you can thank Fight Club. More book sales are going up. See in the comments, people are buying the book. But question from Jeff. Again, I think you can go ahead and you able to ask live, Jeff? You get your mic and all that stuff up?
I got my mic, but now my camera isn't working
Okay,
right.
over to you.
Okay, real quick, Jim, you'd spoken about, number of hours for planning kind of as a maximum figure, I guess, at various levels of command. Way back when, one of the tenets that I remember employing at headquarters was always maintaining at least 2/3 of available time for subordinate units, both to plan and execute. Does that figure still apply? Is that figure different in your view? Because sometimes I think you end up with a time box that's bigger that could be tempting to grab more time to make your plan a little bit more refined, or pump out some more pages. Other times the time box may be smaller and you have to shrink below the figures you were talking about earlier. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I'm just flicking through and looking for the right page, and I don't really want to do this because I think I'm getting down into the weeds.
Yeah, and I'm in the middle of your book. I haven't read the whole thing yet. I'm still working through it.
No, that's fine. But when you actually put those numbers in, if you looked at page 107, you'll find actually the 1/3, 2/3 does work. But more to the point, if you look at those kind of things, then what it means in real life is at about noon, Corps has worked out what it wants its divisions to be doing tomorrow if it's significantly different. It gets its orders to divisions by something like 1800. And divisions, and I'm not going to go all the way down, need to do it that by tomorrow, meaning first light, let's call it notionally 0600, the brigades kick off and do something else. It's that sort of thing. Now, if you look at practically every war that you've ever heard of since the Battle of Waterloo, that's roughly what they were doing. And I think they were doing that in Operation Iraqi Freedom, and I think they were doing that in Operation Desert Storm and those kind of things. And yet somehow we've got into our training to allow, the most amazing, what we call BAT procedure, these long timelines, divisions of 36 hours to plan. You go, in your dreams, they need to tell their brigades what to do and that was the sort of philosophy underpinning that. But yes, in round terms, if you follow it through, and I think, as I say, it's page 107, 1/3, 2/3. But to go back to the point that I made to Ed, that imposes discipline. I mean, I remember when I was what you would call a battalion S3. We were in Berlin. It was 1989. But my commanding officer, I would say beat into me, but made it absolutely down the line that when we got new mission from brigade, we could talk to our companies 1 hour later, because that was our job, so that they had time to do what they needed to do. In other words, it was an imposed discipline, which the commanding officer, who was old school, he joined the army in, I think, 1969. But that's what he'd been told by people who had served in the Second World War. So thanks for that, Jeff. Good question. But yes, absolutely. Let's do 2/3.
Des.
Yep, great. Thanks, Arno. Hi, Jim. Des Fitzgerald, a long-time admirer and reader of your work and articles. What an observation I have, and I'll lead it into a question. But essentially, it seems to me we now have commanders at every level do a tiny bit of the planning. They write their intent and then disappear off, and then leave the staff to generate ideas, and then normally come back after a period of however long they've been given, and then pick apart what the staff's done and go, no, that's not what I wanted. And certainly my reading, I think certainly when the 7 questions came in, and as we moved to that, it was explicit that commanders were responsible for the planning process from start to finish. And we seem to have moved away from that. And I wonder if that's perhaps part of the reason why things now just take longer and we've got more staff doing stuff.
Des, you're absolutely right. The bit in planning process which effectively the commander sits there, listens, says a few words and goes off and gets a coffee whilst the staff, sorry, just not right. What are commanders for if not to receive a mission, to think about it, to make a plan and give orders? Now, by all means, the staff should support him in that, but it has to be him. What we've got at the moment is a process where it's not him. And that it's in what you said, and to quote him, if you like, and I know he's a notional quote, no, that's not what I wanted. Well, he knew what he wanted, otherwise he wouldn't have said that. So why didn't we get him to write that down? And that's basically the outline of the plan. And again, I'll just go back to put a bit of human experience on this, go back to Berlin. That commanding officer, been around, old school, this, that, and the other, would look at a new order from brigade and he'd say, right, Jim, get your notebook out. And in simple round terms, he would start dictating the outline of a set of orders, more or less straight off the top of his head, because he broadly knew what to do and he knew where he needed input from the staff. I mean, for example, the indirect fire bit, but he would tell the gunner or the mortar guy the sort of things he wanted. And then they would come back, they'd discuss it for maybe a minute or two, but then write their bit. So it was very much came from the commander. And I think there's a really, really big risk in the way that we do things at the moment. And I've seen it in some headquarters. And to be honest, I'm not just being patriotic here. I haven't yet seen it in a British brigade, British formation headquarters, but I've seen other headquarters where, in round terms, the commander is clearly hiding behind his staff because he hasn't got he may have the intellectual horsepower, but he hasn't got the training and experience to do it. And I think there's an increasing risk that, in fact, no, I'd put it more strongly than that. April, I was on a battlefield tour with a guy called Brigadier Jim Tanner of the Staffordshire Regiment. He'd commanded a brigade, I think, in the early 90s, but he made the observation when we were talking about these, that in the days when the staff didn't know what to do, so they'd come up through the new process, but the commanders, people of his generation, still did, it wasn't a problem because he'd just tell them, no, what I want is this, you go and write a set of orders that does whatever. But you've now got a generation of commanders, and bearing in mind they're all materially younger than me, even the chief of the general staff's younger than me, and they have not been through that discipline. So they think, for good reason, they need to allow the staff to do things. I think that's a problem, and I think it's misguided. But I'd go back to the point that I said earlier. I think most of them are able and well-intentioned people. And if we just said, no, General, take your staff away, make them do things faster, and that will require a bit of sweat, a bit of effort, and a bit of failure. Well, okay, let's be bigger than that. Let's get through that. Then actually we'd be better off in the long run. But basically, yeah, I agree with you entirely. Thank you.
Thank you, Des. Go over to Mark Flanagan. Are you able to, Mark, do you have the ability to turn on your mic and ask the question, or would you rather have me read it?
Yeah, I can.
Oh, there you go.
Sorry,
Thanks,
I was just going to post something in just a link, because it sounds very much what you're saying, Jim, is that you'd like to have the land version of the Naval War College between the First and Second World War, where they did extensive planning operations, whereby at the start of the year, the staff officers may be kind of going through the process in a slow manner, but by the end of the year, they can really churn out effective orders quickly. And those effective orders are actually tested against effectively a war game in many different forms and fashions across a range of scenarios that they're likely to encounter, and the hypothetical as well. Is that feasible in the British Army?
Yeah, it's entirely feasible. There's much more to this, and you get into the issues of training and whole of life training of officers and so on and so forth. But the nub of the word is familiarity. Let's just say that we're going to deploy a force to I'm going to be deliberately non-contentious here, some hypothetical country in, say, South America that we know nothing about. We can't expect our people to know much about that, but we can develop processes by which, in the time that we have to work up for deployment, they become familiar with it. We can come up with processes by which they get to work out what kind of things are likely to work when they get there. In other words, we can build up familiarity and we can build up repetition. A really good one, I mean, you talked about the Naval War College. I'm not familiar with that, but I do know a particular one. The later Field Marshal von Manstein was appointed to command a corps in Stettin. Ironically, it's Cambrai Barracks, which you probably know of. The British think it's a battle honor. Well, the Germans obviously thought it was a battle honor for them. But Cambrai Barracks, which is currently the headquarters of, I think it's Multinational Corps Northeast. And he took over the corps with a corps staff that was assembled especially for the process. They had no divisions, but basically what he made them do was he made them do a command post exercise once every week for 5 weeks. And at the end of that, he had a worked up staff. They were familiar with the sort of things that might happen in the France campaign, which is where his corps went, and how the corps commander wanted things to be done. So there are ways that we can adjust our process, our training process, in order to make our commanders and our staff familiar and fast and, more to the point, accurate in a way which their subordinates, i.e. people down the chain of command, can understand and action in a fast and timely way as well. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Go over to been eager to get Brendan into the fight here, get our Marines in. So Brendan, you had a question here about sir, do you have your ability to turn off the mic? I was hoping to.
Can you hear me there?
Gotcha.
Thanks, Jim. I haven't read the book. I just ordered it, so I appreciate your stuff. But I was looking for historical examples. What is your opinion of the best division to brigade to battalion to company level execution historically in the British Army that occurred for real world? In my experience, that's what people like to hear. Hey, we've done this before. I've seen it done, or I've heard it done. Someone's done it. They can do it. You can do it too.
What's the best example? I could think of several, but there's a really quite a good one. I think it's Dempsey commanding 2nd British Army to Horrocks. It's late August or maybe early September 1944. And he says something like, Horrocks, you are to seize 1 Liège, 2, was it Liège, 2 Brussels? It was something like that. Horrocks was a corps commander. And basically what he said was, right, it's the afternoon now. By tomorrow morning, I want you in Brussels. It's that sort of thing. I can't remember the details, but the order was pretty close. But importantly, the Normandy campaign had lasted 10 weeks. The divisions that they had were worked up. Some of them, and I can't remember exactly which divisions he had under command, but at least a couple of them had served throughout the Western Desert and then spent a couple of months back in Britain. By the end of the Normandy campaign, these guys were used to receiving short orders and getting on with it. So it goes back to my point about familiarity. My all-time best, however, you sort of ruined my surprise. My best is actually not from the British Army. It's the French Army, and I think it's the 23rd of August 1944. And General de Division Leclerc, commanding 2nd French Armored Division, is ordered to seize Paris the following morning. It's 1 page long. Now, to be fair, and I'm not just saying this because Arnold's on the line, but 4th United States Infantry Division seized Paris south of the River Seine. But nonetheless, Leclerc seized Paris, or most of it, the following day. And it was 1 page long. Well, if that's not a good example, what is?
Thank you.
Brendan, thank you. So Brendan's been him and John Schmidt have been helping educate us in the Fight Club on tactical decision games. So appreciate him staying connected with us and making us smarter on how to fight. But great question, Brendan. I mean, I see some of my brothers and sisters from the NATO ARC in the chat in the Zoom here, and I mean we know we need to do better because even in exercise we're cutting orders that are getting to the down trace just too late. They're already executing the white gap crossing, and they're just too long. And we've tried hard to improve the timeline, and I mean technology can help, but that's where I think a lot of your wisdom's helped us, Jim. Is we've tried really hard to cut, to compress the timeline and practice it. So practice planning, practice fighting, It's what we all need to do. So, all right. So there's more questions here, Ed. Do you have one teed up already?
Yeah, so anyone who's followed Jim on Twitter will know he's not shy of stating an opinion on the sort of academic pollution of military thinking. So Peter, could you follow up with your question, please? Okay, I'll read it out for Peter. Peter essentially has asked, how has the priority on creating, quote, academic officers spoiled tactically able officers? Are civilian faculty detrimental to officer education?
I think there's two sides to that. I got an interesting observation not long ago, and this isn't a dig at the Royal Navy, because I think the Royal Navy are brilliant, but until recently, they basically spent no time on what you might call general officer education. It was all, if you like, technical tactical. And I suspect that's that's too far one way. But the problem is now that we've put so much of that stuff, which is basically good stuff, or rather much of it is good stuff, into the syllabus, that in round terms, there isn't enough space in the syllabus for the sort of things that we need to do. I mean, for example, straight over to you, Ed, I think I'm right in saying that on the Majors course, the initial Command and Staff course, Land, you basically do 2 terms, of which one is academic and the other one is military. Is that right?
Yeah, so we do a sort of staff term and then a ops term would be the report is generally finalized about halfway through the ops term, which tells you what the weighting is.
Right, okay. But what I did do was I went through how many weeks of all that kind of stuff you've got. Bearing in mind that an officer who's done that course might end up with no further courses, being the chief of staff of a division, that means he's done significantly less than, for example, I mentioned General James Everard, DSACUR, earlier. He went from Staff College to be Chief of Staff of, I think, 4th Armoured Brigade. Well, anybody who does that now will have had less training than he did. Well, that can't be right. And I go back to my point about the fact that armies, or at least the British Army, misspend their officers' time, partly by teaching too much explicit process, but also making space in the syllabus for wider education, which has some value, but to the detriment of just doing enough training to be good enough to know what they're doing.
It's good questions. Thank you for that. We got a question here from Dermot. He's not able to turn on his mic, but says, Jim, can you please tell us something about the gap between the formal and informal command systems, i.e. how the bosses sidestep the lengthy process?
Yeah, there's a really interesting one there. I was talking to someone not long ago, and they said, so Chief of Staff says, right, we need to do 3 options. For the force package here, I want a light, a medium, and a heavy. So the staff go off, and however many hours later, they come back with ideas for a force package, 1 light, 1 medium, 1 heavy, and he goes, no, that's not quite what I wanted. So what I want you to do is now go off and explore something that I'm calling tough. And what he meant by tough was somewhere between medium and heavy. So the staff went off and came back with something. He says, yeah, that's more or less it. Let me finesse that, horrible word, finesse. And he says, right, that's what I want. Now, in all that, the Chief of Staff clearly knew what he wanted. But he insisted that his staff went through the formal process. Well, going back to the Cold War, he wouldn't have asked his staff at all. He would have just done it himself. So one thing is, in terms of formal and informal, it's about, formality is about making people, can be seen as making people doing the explicit process. And I think that's generally a waste of time. If the commander or the chief staff officer or whatever generally does have a good idea of what needs to be done, why doesn't he have the self-confidence? Why don't we allow him or her the slack to just go and say, right, people, I want this. I want you to work out the detail of that bit and you to work out the detail of that bit and come back to me in 10 minutes. So some of it is a consequence of all the explicit process that we've given ourselves. There's far more to it than that, and I wouldn't claim to be an expert in terms of formal and informal hierarchies and chains of command. You get into some things like people who have served with people in the past. I mean, a good one that I think it's fairly common knowledge, but the recent chief of the, two chiefs of the general staff ago, who was General Nick Carter, had been a battalion commander, and his second in command, the current chief of the general staff, and his signals officer was the current Major General Tom Coppinger Symes. So in other words, ever since they were in battalion together, those guys have come up knowing each other informally. So there's all sorts of social, professional, procedural issues behind there, and I don't think I've given a particularly good answer to that one.
No, thanks for the question. And, you know, I'm sitting in PME right now, and there is a big concern that we're not teaching enough about war and spending less time on process, doing more wargaming. There's this big debate playing out right now in our war colleges. I see Dez's hand up. Over to you, Des.
Great, thanks, Arnell. Jim, slightly contentiously, what are your thoughts on course of action wargaming?
In simple round terms, I don't believe in it. I don't think we've got the time. I don't think that course of action wargaming tells us anything very much, apart from a few coordinating details. The response to that, and I've seen this in writing, is that the analysts, meaning the DSDL community, say yes, but some of those coordinating details are the critical ones, which is reasonable. My response to that is, if we had done enough of this in training, so we were broadly familiar with the kinds of problems and the kinds of solutions, we would know what those the critical coordinating details were anyway, and we wouldn't need a course of action wargaming to do that. Now, you asked a fairly narrow and specific question. That is not my opinion of the value of wargaming as a whole. And in my book, for example, I talk about there's a thing called the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, which basically wargamed anti-submarine warfare in the Second World War, which is very, very telling. I also think there's a lot to be said for wargaming in command and staff training short of operations, but that's a completely different issue. In other words, a wider understanding of wargaming.
I think we could all appreciate that. I mean, there's even I know in the Marine Corps, they were looking at why make co as just the commander, just direct one, and then maybe have time to wargame it and then go, you know, exercise his military tuition. Okay, good stuff. Ed, over to you.
Okay, so we partially touched on this, Jim, with the wargaming question, but I suppose it would be remiss of us as UK Fight Club to not try and push this angle a bit more. Linking it back to the back end of your book, talking about what you can do to get that familiarity and to sort of train the naturalistic decision making. We think wargaming is one of those tools. We've done a previous webinar on tactical decision games, which Brendan and John kindly ran. John's not on the call now, but Brendan is. You mentioned also the power of sort of command post exercises or tabletop exercises run by a good facilitator. So is there anything else that we should be looking at to do, which is to cheap, effective, and preferably avoiding computers and networks, having dealt with some of those this week?
Yeah, I think there is. There's a diagram in the book, but just to describe it, if you put the process in the middle of the picture, you've got inputs at one end, outputs at the other end, and then outcomes beyond that. And outcomes are the interaction of the output with the external world. Now, in command and staff training, we can't know outcomes. I mean, we can't fight real battles, so we have to do the best we can. At the moment, what I've pointed out is there's far too much dwelling on decision-making process. What I think you can do usefully with all sorts of wargaming is to go much further to the right, which is the relation between output and outcome. Give people a bit of time, not necessarily very much, but to come up with a plan, and then wargame it and see what happens. And if your wargame is anything like realistic, things will happen that they hadn't anticipated. It might win. Sorry, the course of action might win. The course of action might fail. But oh, I hadn't thought of that, or who'd have thought that that could have happened, or yeah, we really need to concentrate on that bit of it. Now, don't try and cast that in stone. Just use that to inform the next time you do it. But then do it a few more times. Do it 5, 6, 7 times. Instead of taking 14 hours to do an estimate, why don't we do 4 of those war games in the same 14 hours and learn quite a lot of it? Sorry, quite a lot from it. So yes, absolutely. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And your comment is quite illuminating, how we can find 14 hours for an estimate or 14 hours to clean some piece of kit, but we can't find 14 hours to set some reps of wargaming, and that's a cultural problem.
Yeah, I think you're right. Some of this comes down to the priorities which in practice we employ in barracks. Yes, absolutely.
Good. We're talking wargaming. We're all fans of that. I'm going to call on my mate from the Royal Air Force, Wing Commander Andy Butterfield. Daisy, you able to turn on your mic? You have a question? Andy Butterfield. Okay. He's probably trying to jump in from headquarters arc with no comms. Did I hear Andy? No? Okay. Trying to see what other questions we have here. Lots of comments. He's trying again. Okay. Go ahead, Andy. Or type it into the chat if you need to, mate. Just for context, as he's trying to figure out his microphone, Jim, Andy replaced me over Project Prometheus at the NATO Allied Rapid Action Course. So a lot of your ideas are what we're using as the base to generate this experiment on planning, where we believe that we've taken the planning process that usually took, the core planning process that took 3 weeks, and we think we've condensed it down to 3 days with time for wargaming. Leveraging some technology, an AI program called One Brief that allows us to just not waste time with PowerPoint, to present to the commander the slides that are the data for the information right onto the One Brief. And we've carved off a lot of time, and it's made it really concise and tight and more clear what we're trying to tell our divisions what to do, so that when we do fight in these warfighter sets, we're not, falling behind, doing what you had mentioned in the, like in the opening of the book, you mentioned back in Kosovo or Bosnia, the order from GFC Naples, Joint Force Command Naples, came about a month later after you guys were about to, the ARC was redeploying, and it was a big doorstop or something of that nature. So, okay, so Andy, no mic. As an air guy, how would you, on the other domains fit into your timelines? Okay, so I guess he's asking, we talk a lot about land headquarters formations. What about other services? Is there some universal principles or practicality for other domains in terms of your thinking? Hopefully I got that right, Andy.
Sorry, over to me.
Yeah, please, Jim.
Yeah, so some of this discussion goes back at least the 26 years, I think it is, since the Staff College. And it goes, for example, to the 72-hour air tasking order. Now, I think we all get that. I think we all understand why air tasking has a 3-day circular process. The real issue, however, is how much detail the airmen want to put into it, as opposed to need to put into it. And so, for example, if you just come up with, I'm going to put so much to air superiority, I'm going to put so much to deep strike missions, I'm going to put so much to air interdiction or close air support, but then leave the tasking till very, very much later in the day. Can you do that in a way which allows, for example, division to say, hey, Wing Commander, tomorrow at first light, what we want is your close air support sorties to do X, Y, and Z in support of brigades 1, 2, and 3. Well, yes, of course we can do that. We were doing that in the Second World War when it had to be done by on telephone or dispatch rider. So again, this is a matter of process that and the amount of flexibility we put into it. But I don't necessarily see it should be a big problem to coordinate elements of, say, for example, the 72-hour timeline with the requirements of land formations. Surely it's the easiest thing in the world to tell a pilot to do something else. Now, I know they have other things to think about, but in simple round terms, think of wings of typhoons taking you off from airfields in Normandy in 1944 and being over the target within 15 minutes. It's doable.
Got a good question here I really like from a different Andy Bell, and it kind of links with what Brandon put a question here as well on what are the things we delete for command post exercises. And Andy's asking, do we generally have insufficient resources to get formations in the field, but do these command post exercises give us enough practice and familiarity with tactical problems to allow for naturalistic decision making?
I'm looking at the question. Yeah, Andy Bell. Yes, I know you. No, there's a history there, and it's all good. But the trouble with the trouble there is what we actually ask our people to do on command post exercises. And yes, I think it is entirely possible to put a commander and staff in some tents or barns or whatever it is, and give them enough time to do these things. But the problem is we currently do so on a timeline of we're going to give divisions 36 hours to plan and all that kind of good stuff. I go back to my point, and this is all self-reinforcing. If we insisted that they did it faster, we could do more of it. We could do it 3 times in the time that we currently take to do it once. That means that we could expose them to 3 different, slightly different scenarios or tactical problems or whatever. They would become more familiar, and they would become better at it. So I go back to the point I made earlier, it's not necessarily the time we have available, it's how we use that time.
Brilliant. Yeah, and then, I don't know if he's still in here, Patrick from Norway had taken on from like the Marine Corps tactical decision games, had us doing at the corps level, making time to just practice, here, you're division commander, here's a problem, go, what are you doing? Really insightful drill for us to do those kinds of things, and we got to make time for that kind of stuff. We don't do it often enough. We need to fix our calendars and our diaries to make room for that kind of stuff. Okay, do you question again from Brendan, and then we'll go over to Neville. Do you believe in deputy commanders? Do they slow the process down?
No, they're a nuisance and they get in the way. But can I just go back slightly? If it's not the same, Andy Bell, then I apologize, but never mind. Right. I've got to be very careful because I could be breaking your confidence. I'm not going to do that. The evidence from the Second World War is they're a nuisance and they got in the way. The habit of deputy commanders crept into US infantry divisions because of an accident of what you might call the promotion system. And what happened since then is that people made jobs for them to do, and that by and large, people, particularly deputy commanders, but also people who have deputies, would say they're indispensable. Well, they would do, wouldn't they? And I think it's on page 134, and I'm quoting back to the officer who had been a deputy commander. I'm just going to check. I'm fairly sure it's page 134. And it says something like, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? There are all sorts of plausible reasons for having deputy commanders, but in simple round terms, I think they either do nothing useful or, and I think Dermot online would agree with this. Yes, it does say page 134. Well, they would, wouldn't they? they either do nothing useful or they do something which is not useful. In other words, they get in the way and they slow the process down, and they dilute the workable and direct relationship between the commander and his key staff. That's my opinion. That's my opinion based on what I've read going on quite a long time. There are some times when a thing called a deputy commander is useful, but I think you have to be very, very careful in defining what those things are.
Looks like Brandon, you answered, he's in agreement there, a thumbs up. Go to Neville, sir. Are you able to, it looks like you're on your iPhone. Can you ask a question from your phone?
Yeah, good evening, Jim. Thanks for a great book. I'm halfway through it, and you find me tonight traveling home from supporting just one of these brigade exercises that we're all talking about this evening. To what extent do you think that a lot of this might be solved or encouraged if a lot more of our exercises, CPXs and training was adversarial, and where the training audience don't just fight the main events list, but actually fighting a thinking enemy that may not conform to the 36-hour timescale that they're given? Thank you.
Neville, smack on. I think that every command post exercise which is done by a reformation in the field should be adversarial, two-sided, and done in real time. Because if you did that, one of the first things that people realize is they've got a lot faster. If the other guy does something simple, violent, and threateningly painful before you're ready, you're not going to like it. You're going to have to respond, and you're going to be on the back foot from then onwards. What that means is next time round, you're going to want to do things faster so that he can't preempt you. So that's a very, very good reason why things should be two-sided, because people will very, very rapidly see the need for speed. The other thing is that a two-sided exercise, the enemy comes up with something that the planner hadn't expected. They always do. And that will make them think, and that will make it far more realistic. The other thing is, of course, we should be training for war, not training for an exercise. And in war, the enemy doesn't follow an MEL. So don't we train like we fight as far as we can, which is to say two-sided, adversarial, and in real time.
Yep.
Neville, that was a really good question. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you indeed, Neville. Yeah, good. Soren has got a good comment here. I think maybe you can turn your mic on and ask your question live, Soren, sir.
Sure. Good evening.
Oh, there you are. Good.
Yeah, and both mic and cameras working, so I'm all good. I also read the book, Jim, so thanks for that. I'm not sure that General Leclerc's orders to take Paris would have been praised on a thoroughly scripted NATO exercise where the person in the back runs the exercise according both to a checklist, but also to SACEUR's combat readiness evaluation criteria. So it seems you started the intro by dividing between the rational paradigm and the pragmatic paradigm. It seems that we are caught in the rational paradigm, and it is much more than staff and orders. It is also exercises, maybe even professionalism. Are we even able to recognize a good plan or a good outcome when we see it?
No, we're not. Sorry, I'm guessing from your name, Søren, that you're Danish.
That is correct.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, there's a joke in there that the title of the book, Something Rotten, you probably know from, there's a quote from Shakespeare, there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. It's not about Denmark. And in fact, I think it was a couple of Danish officers who pointed out that apparently you have an idea that when a headquarters get to 100 people, it doesn't need any input, it'll run itself, which I thought was just one of the best lines I've heard in a long time. No, I think you're absolutely right. Now, go back to pragmatism. Leclerc wrote an order which was 1 page long. And the following morning, in fact, actually later that evening, because someone wanted to be quick off the mark, they got off and they occupied Paris. Well, if that isn't pragmatism, what is? Now, I'd go back to the book which Arnold mentioned, but wasn't up there, which is my first, which is The Human Face of War, in which I introduced pragmatism and empiricism. What we need in order to win wars and engagements, and to that extent wars, is pragmatism and empiricism. Find out what works and do it, because all the rational theory in the world won't work in the real world, and pragmatism and empiricism will. And I go back to Neville's point. We can get close to simulating that by having command post exercises which are two-sided, adversarial, and in real time, because the enemy is all of those things. Really good point. Yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you, Storr. Cam, scanning for any final questions here, or are we kind of reaching the point? Let's see here. I have one left. Andy, all right, mate. Let's go, buddy.
I'm still going to try it. Can you hear me?
Oh, I got you, mate. All right, go ahead.
Okay, I'm sat in the car. So what I wanted to say was you compared the speaker to Little Heart. I just hope there's not a Guderian sat in Moscow reading the book, because I truly believe we need to be quicker. And I believe with everything that you said. Now, in terms of that, how do we change? How do you suggest that we change from the top down? Over.
Well, thank you. I go back to what I started with earlier. Let's first of all impose on people the requirement to do things faster. Let's then pick up, I think it was Neville's point about having an enemy, and I said on every single exercise that's real, adversarial, and in real time. And I think when you do that, which gets much closer to Søren's point about being pragmatic and empirical, then you will start pushing in the right direction. And to pick up on Guderian, please do look, if you haven't already done, there's a book by Karl-Heinz Frieser, who looked in detail at which German headquarters wrote which as when in the Battle of France, 1940, including Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps, and on the other side, which French headquarters wrote which orders when. And way back then in 1940, the Germans were faster. They weren't necessarily technically better, whatever that means, but they were quicker. And time again, the French were preempted by an hour or so, but they were preempted. Now, what that means is 82 years ago, we, the Western Allies, learnt the hard way that being faster is hugely important. Now, if that was true 82 years ago, surely it's still true now. And as for someone who puts up John Boyd rides again, no, I don't think John Boyd's got it right. Boyd's model is not particularly good. But the basic thing about deciding and acting faster than the other guy, I think he's smack on the nail. So John Tapsfield, thanks for that point.
Okay, we'll go to Jeff next.
Quick question. Okay, so our discussion here about I'll call it the headquarters problem, has been about the formal planning process and orders generation procedure, along with all the trappings and high ceremony that goes with that. Can you, Jim, could you give us a few comments about the headquarters problem as it applies to fragmentary orders during the execution of a mission or an operation? And if you need an example, like think in terms of like an advance to contact, where the situation is very nebulous and you have to discover things and decide where your opportunities are in order to exploit them. And how do you do that efficiently? Thank you.
Right. I don't think it's a problem. I think there's far too much of fragos and all that kind of good stuff. First of all, if we genuinely believe in decentralizing control or command down lower levels, then the people who will find out complex issues and emergent situations will be low-level commanders. And if we empower them and we make sure that they know broadly what the intention is, we allow them to get on and deal with things and create opportunities for themselves, but also create opportunities for people at high levels. If we produce very short, quick orders, then we can do so more or less off the hoof. It doesn't take very long, a few sentences, There are some good examples, really good examples. I think it's 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force in Iraqi Freedom. Again, it's in the book, but I took them there from, my comments come from a guy who studied there at Marine Corps Command and General Staff course, and actually in some cases interviewed the officers involved. Officers commanding regimental combat teams, that is to say brigade level, basically giving orders, what you might refer to as fragos, as of a few sentences given over the radio. That surely is what we'd be able to achieve. That's what they could achieve 10, 15 years ago. That's what was being achieved regularly in the Second World War. I don't see why it has to be more difficult than that.
It's good. Thanks, Jeff, for that question. So we got another one here from, he doesn't have the ability to ask live, Jim. His name is Justin. It's a really good question here about at what point in the planning process is some level of detail and coordination required to account for things such as our air and artillery coordination, airspace deconfliction, and even simple coordination amongst units to identify friendly fire incidents or to prevent them. And how can these complicated details be covered and coordinated quickly?
We have invented so much process to do that that we have made it almost practically impossible. I actually think that we can go a long way, and we have gone a long way, to avoid fratricide, both air-ground and indirect fire. But the problems of fratricide that we had, for example, in 1944, were fairly easily overcome, and the biggest single problem actually was incredibly poor aircraft recognition. Could we come up in 1944 with procedures to deconflict the airspace? Yes. Could we, and this is perhaps worth going to, I think it's either the Hall of Mirrors or it might be in battle, could we get to the point where we could bring down up to 1,000 guns on a single target in 53 minutes using telephones and radios in 1944? Yes, we could. And the reason why we could do that was we had good, simple, clear procedures, which we had practiced and practiced, practiced and practiced, and we were good at it. And not only were we good at it, but we could do it quickly and safely. We've now invented, it knows how much process, which just gets in the way and stops sensible people from doing it. I think the best example of the things that I'm talking about, when I was G3 of a brigade, well, I was actually what you would call the G3-5, and the G3-7 was a captain who had come from being the S3 of an armored regiment on Operation Desert Storm. And he was just a brilliant battle captain. He could do all those things that you're talking about as a relatively young captain because he knew what he was doing. He could deconflict things not quite entirely in his head. He needed a map and he needed a log and that kind of good stuff, but he could do those things. He could do things which now employ about 5 majors in the same headquarters. Well, if that's the case, we've gone backwards. And I know there's one guy online, I've seen his name rolling through on the chat, who says that we should be no worse than our forefathers were, but are. And I agree with him entirely. And he owes me a pint for that one.
We definitely need to do better. I mean, a lot of that stuff, some of it, a lot of times is SOPs that are drills that we should already have down to save time. And then technology might be able to help with the air deconfliction and some of that kind of stuff. But all right, so I think we have got time for one more question. And so I'm going to go over to Jason Jones. Jason, you have, there you go. Go ahead, brother.
Yeah, hey, Jim. Thanks so much. This has really been a great session, and thanks to Arnell and UK Fight Club for setting it up. But you know, as we listen to it and we talk about it, it really, a lot of this seems to point to risk and the fear of a mistake, you know, causing that. And does that drive this 500-page operations order that every staff element needed to get a step in? And where do we, you know, where do we move past that as we try and drive down that process? Thank you.
Yeah, Jason, the risk aversion is professional risk aversion, that some commanders think that by being seen to go through the process, that makes them bomb-proof against reproach. Right. If that is the case, then it's false incentive. Basically, should be telling their superiors, you should not really give a tinker's cuss, to be very English about it, about the process that Brigadier General X goes through. You should really be concerned is whether he comes up with a good plan and whether you think that his people can avoid battlefield risk as opposed to professional risk. And the other problem is, and this gets into the psychology of it, and some of the people online are better at this than me. The trouble is that with staffs that big doing that much process, they introduce error which doesn't get detected. Now, the way to cut that sort of error out is to get people to wargame and wargame and wargame, and they will realize that they're making those errors and they will learn to avoid them. I think actually, if I may say so, we're all agreeing with each other. I mean, the fact that you're nodding there, yeah, what more can I say?
Yeah, and good answer. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Jim, we've come to the respectful of your time and everybody else's. This has been a really fantastic interactive discussion, one of the better ones we've had with these webinars. And so really, really big thanks to you and to the audience tonight. Really good discussion, lots to learn. We need to cut down our staffs. We need to make short, concise orders. And we need to do it timely so we can get it down to our down trace units so that we can win in more. A lot of good gold dust there for us all to take away. And hopefully got you some more book sales tonight. So it was worth your time, sir. But that's it. And really big thanks to you. Any final comments, closing comments from you? I'll leave it to you to close us out.
Yes, thank you. However, I'd like to finish where I started off. I think we should be mindful that a really great lady passed away today. Thank you, everyone.